For his role as Ed Norton, Art Carney received 6 Emmys. He won an Oscar ahead of Al Pacino. But he didn't say a word when his well-known co-star from The Honeymooners passed away in 1996. Hollywood as a whole paid their respects. The family of Jackie Gleason sent flowers. On TV, former cast members sobbed. Art Carney said nothing. In her memoir, she had described him as compassionate and smart. She hoped they will speak again in the future. They didn't. Nobody realized the depth of what transpired between them. On November 4, 1918, Art Carney was born in Mount Vernon, New York. He came from a profoundly Irish Catholic home and was the youngest of 6 boys. Art was more influenced by the alcohol that permeated their home like water than by his father's job as a newspaperman. He has 3 older brothers that drank. His dad also had a drink. According to Art, the majority of us males did not smoke, but we did drink. That was a warning, not merely a remark. As a youngster, he began drinking on a regular basis, not socially or informally. He was raised to believe that drinking was a natural part of life. The question was not whether he would fall into it, but rather when. He was gifted from an early age. He was quite good at pretending to be Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was him, not just someone who sounded like him. The tone, the voice, the pause. The president appeared to be speaking to those who were listening to the radio. Federal agents get involved because it became so believable. They were concerned that it could lead to confusion during the conflict. His performance was even mistaken for speeches by foreign diplomats. It made him famous, but it was also risky. Later, he imitated not just Roosevelt, but also Churchill and Eisenhower by using that voice on radio appearances. Thanks to his older brother, Carney was already performing with the Horace Heights Orchestra at the age of 18. It sounded glitzy. No, it wasn't. Fred Lowry, a blind whistler, shared a room with him. In addition, he introduced Art, rather than coffee, to morning sipping, every day grapefruit juice and gin. It seemed liberating at first. That freedom swiftly turned into a cage despite the absence of restrictions and shame. Before he even realized it, he was addicted. He had a distinct memory of one moment. During a live broadcast, he was inebriated enough to misspell the sponsor's name Tums. He stumbled through the advertisement. The sponsors were incensed. Before they could discharge him, he departed the band at the age of 23. The war then broke out. His 4th wedding anniversary was August 15, 1944. He was a machine gunner with the 28th Infantry Division in France. Nearby, a German mortar detonated. His right thigh was ripped up by shrapnel. He had yet to discharge his firearm. He later quipped that he had never fired a shot and perhaps never wanted to. However, the injury was serious. The difference between his right and left legs was 3/4 of an inch. He spent the remainder of his life limp. After 9 months of recuperation, a man with a Purple Heart and severe injuries returned home with a metal but invisible scars. He was clearly limping. It wasn't trauma. He continued to drink. Barbiturates are what he utilized. He began to use amphetamines. For him, the conflict had only lasted 2 months, but the consequences persisted indefinitely. He experienced breakdowns. He was unable to handle pressure. Back then, no one referred to it as PTSD, but that's what it was. In 1965, he even had to quit The Odd Couple due to a breakdown. After the war, it would take him almost 30 years to get clean. Carney was all over the radio in the late 1940s. He collaborated with Maury Amsterdam, Fred Allen, and Milton Berle. He was the second banana and the preferred sidekick. He was drinking more than ever behind the stage, but he could pull off any voice or joke. Even though he occasionally blacked out and occasionally slurred on air, they continued to hire him. His gift was too uncommon. Rather than tackling his alcoholism, producers worked around it. He had a major issue after the war. He found a method to make a hobbling man successful on TV. He wore shoes that were specially intended to balance his legs, but he didn't just cover up his limp. He made use of it. He incorporated it into his humor. His peculiar gaits and dancing techniques weren't arbitrary. Rather, they were survival strategies. He transformed suffering into performance. His admirers simply laughed and were unaware of it. But the truth continued to pursue him. The drinking worsened. With the Horace Heights Band, he had already been on edge, and now his drinking had returned with a bang. He didn't want to leave the band when he did so at the age of 23. He did it out of necessity. He was a liability. One bridge had already been damaged by his addiction. There would be a lot more. He gave stand-up comedy a shot. It was unsuccessful. He was afraid of the stage, not because he wasn't hilarious. His uneasiness was provoked by the faces of the throng, the silence, and the pressure. To relax, he took a drink. He then sharpened himself by using medicines. Then, in order to sleep, he needed more tablets. He had started a vicious loop: drugs, embarrassment, fear, and so on. A spotlight was too much for the same man who made radio stars sparkle. His private life was haunted as well. In 1940, he wed Jean Myers, his high school girlfriend, old friend. Paul, Brian, and Eileen, the 3 children they had. However, the strain of addiction caused the marriage to fall apart. Because he didn't feel like he belonged, Art Carney nearly missed his chance to make television history. Carney believed it was an error when radio writers proposed him for a comedy with Jackie Gleason on Cavalcade of Stars in 1951. Gleason was already becoming well-known. Carney didn't believe that someone so well-known was even aware of his identity. False modesty was not what it was. As Newton, the waiter on the Maury Amsterdam program, he had been stealthily taking center stage. He still thought of himself as a little time, though. Everything that came after would be influenced by that attitude. A room might be filled with the talent of this man. Nevertheless, he had self-doubt at every turn. Ed Norton was introduced to the world when that sketch became The Honeymooners. He became famous for his white t-shirt, unbuttoned vest, and pork pie hat. However, things weren't always easy behind the scenes. Carney aimed for excellence. He felt that every line, gesture, and beat should be practiced. Gleason desired impromptuness. He believed the magic would be ruined by too much practice. Carney would arrive prepared to practice. Gleason declined. Thus, Carney developed Norton's persona separately. To cover up a limp from a battle injury, he even wore special shoes. It was all Carney: the goofy dances, the timing, pressure, suffering, and eventually medications drove him to practice alone. The life of Art Carney while filming The Honeymooners was anything but humorous. In front of 1,000 viewers, all 39 programs were shot live at Manhattan's Adelphi Theater. That was sufficient pressure. However, Jackie Gleason made matters more difficult. He was well known for revising screenplays mere hours before the performance. He felt that excessive practice would destroy the spontaneity. As a result, the actors frequently appeared on stage with hardly any line knowledge. It was torment for Carney. A perfectionist he was. He had to get ready. Instead, he would receive fresh lines and stage instructions right before performing live. There was too much anxiousness. To aid one another in surviving, the cast created coded visual cues. When Gleason forgot a line, he would pat his tummy. When someone needed to go to the refrigerator, Audrey Meadows would take a quick look. On TV, it appeared seamless, but backstage, Carney was struggling to keep his composure. He used drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms. Anything to quiet his mental maelstrom. The 1956 cancellation of the show appeared like a major setback. In America, ratings plummeted from number 2 to number 19. However, it was a relief for Carney. No more last-minute edits or last-minute panics before live recordings. Some delayed recordings. Gleason has other plans, according to his manager, and Carney is not one of them. Carney is also pleased with that. He made use of his independence at last. He debuted on Broadway in The Rope Dancers in 1957. He portrayed drunk and troubled parent James Hyland. The play received 6 Tony nominations and played for 189 performances. He was adored by critics. They believed he was a virtuoso at combining sadness, frailty, and appeal. Few understood, however, that the role wasn't particularly difficult. Carney was already a heavy drinker. For years he had been. His most famous theater role followed. Carney made his debut as Felix Unger in Neil Simon's The Odd Couple in 1965. In contrast to Walter Matthau, it was the ideal fit. Matthau was disorganized. Carney was accurate. The show's popularity skyrocketed. Reviewers gushed. Carney's version was referred to as the first and best by Tony Randall, who went on to play Felix on television. Felix was transformed from a clean freak by Carney. He gave him humanity, complexity, humor, and vulnerability. Even Jack Lemmon, who played Felix in the film, found it difficult to break free from Carney's shadow. However, His personal life was collapsing as his stage business was flourishing. His 25-year marriage was disintegrating by 1965. He and Jean Myers have a lengthy history together and 3 children. However, it was unable to withstand his cravings. Carney began drinking while he was a teenager. He was also addicted to amphetamines and barbiturates by the 1960s. He once acknowledged that for breakfast, his former comedy sidekick would have gin and grapefruit juice. With time, it grew worse. After years of support from Jean, his behavior became unpredictable and hazardous. She was at her breaking point. That same year, the marriage ended, and then an even stranger thing occurred. Carney literally started to transform into Felix Unger. Offstage, he started to exhibit obsessive habits. His coin stacking was the most unsettling. In his dressing room, he would arrange coins in precise patterns according to size, color, and value. He couldn't take the stage if even one was off. Coworkers began to notice. They said that because he was unable to stop organizing, he missed cues and postponed sequences. The distinction between the man and the character became hazy. Felix was more than a role now. It was a cage. Only 7 months into the Odd Couple's career, in October 1965, Carney reached his lowest point. He booked himself into a psychiatric institution in Hartford after experiencing a complete mental and physical breakdown. He spent about half a year there. He acknowledged the breakdown, the drugs, and the drinking. He said that I wasn't feeling well and that my first marriage was dissolving. On Broadway, Art Carney had already established himself. Critics and even Tony Randall praised him for his outstanding performance as Felix Unger in The Odd Couple, who went on to claim that Carney was the original and greatest Felix. However, a terrible incident occurred when the 1968 movie version was being made. Instead, Jack Lemmon was selected by Paramount. It has to do with box office attraction, they explained. Carney, however, had another theory. He felt that he was too hazardous, possibly even uninsurable, for a high-budget project because of his recent breakdown and his open admission of addiction. He never forgot that concept. The movie became the 3rd most grossing film of that year, earning approximately $44.05 million. Not only was it disheartening to see it prosper without him, but it also troubled him. However, before Hollywood even abandoned him, there were indications that things were becoming worse. Coworkers and friends began to notice anything odd. Carney began acting like Felix Unger off stage when he was under pressure. He would arrange his spare coinage in neat little towers on the dressing table, with the largest coins at the bottom and the smallest at the top face up. It was obsessed, not simply oddball. Everyone in his vicinity understood what that meant. Once more, he was slipping. The pattern was visible to them. He was on the verge of another collapse the more he behaved like Felix. With time, it was hard to distinguish between Carney and Felix. After that, Jackie Gleason phoned Art Carney in 1966. Trapped in a maze of substance abuse and depression, Carney had disappeared from public life. However, Ed Norton had always been a part of Carney, and Gleason wanted him back. Carney came back in spite of everything. And a miracle occurred when the Honeymooners' comeback was broadcast on the Jackie Gleason Show. The fans blazed. Norton was back and better than ever with his oddball gestures, clumsy dancing, and devoted charm. Nobody anticipated how excellent Carney would be. He received his 4th Emmy in 1966, then in 1967, his 5th, then in 1968, a 6th. 3 Emmys in 3 years, while struggling to keep himself together. The performance included musical performances for the first time. Carney made everyone laugh as if nothing was wrong while he danced and sang. However, he then made a terrifying confession in private. In addition to reviving his career, playing Ed Norton at that moment saved his life. When everything else was crumbling, the persona provided him direction. Even nevertheless, the dazzling lights of the show were unable to conceal what was going on behind the scenes. Carney had kicked medications after his sanitarium treatment, but he was still in a chokehold from the drink. Between 1966 and 1970, the consequences were severe. His look quickly shifted. He appeared decades older at 48. His hands shook, his face grew larger, and he walked more slowly. Makeup couldn't cover up the damage. The time it took to get him ready for each scene grew. Carney was consuming almost a 1/5 of whiskey each day, according to some estimates. That does not include the beers in between takes or the wine at supper. Within weeks, his weight would fluctuate by 30 pounds. Rehearsals were sometimes completely lost on him. Co-star Joyce Randolph once discovered him unconscious in his dressing room. The incident wasn't the first. To preserve the show's clean image, the team learned how to deal with these crises in a discreet manner. However, it was unraveling inside. Carney did something that most actors in his position wouldn't even think about after the 1969 season concluded. He checked himself back into Hartford's same mental health facility. No arrest, no controversy, no action. He knew that he was in trouble, so it was just a calm, calculated action. He was still at the top of his career and had just won another Emmy, but he was drinking more than ever. About 4 months passed during this second stay. He was working, not simply sleeping. He immersed himself in psychotherapy. He participated in group meetings that subsequently influenced the way Alcoholics Anonymous developed its own methodology. He maintained diaries. He dissected his own ideas as thoroughly as he had Norton. He referred to his family's history of drunkenness as the Irish curse. It was methodical rather than theatrical. Even though he didn't immediately stop drinking, the lessons he gained in that hospital would eventually help him give up alcohol permanently in 1974, while Harry and Tonto was being filmed. He never made the decision to go back to the Honeymooners themselves, even as he recovered. Carney remained distant. Gleason and Audrey Meadows remained in contact and attended a few reunions. No commentary, no interviews, and no allusions to nostalgia. In 1996, Carney made no public remarks following Meadows' death. For it, some referred to him as chilly. But it wasn't a matter of indifference to those who knew him. It was a matter of survival. Too much of that period of his life was associated with suffering. Audrey Meadows described Carney as sweet and clever in her 1994 memoir, Love, Alice. However, she acknowledged that they were never close. She felt that he was guilty of something she didn't know. She speculated in a previous interview that perhaps he held himself responsible for something during those difficult years of filming. She didn't say anything sour. They were gentle and melancholy. Later in life, she even considered reaching out, but she chose not to. She claimed that although Art had already moved on from that aspect of his life, mending his personal life was a more difficult task. Art Carney believed he was getting another opportunity in 1966. He married Barbara Isaac a year after he left the hospital and got divorced from Jean Myers, his first wife. She was no ordinary person. She was aware of the pressure because she worked on television behind the scenes. Carney thought she could steady him. That felt true for a time. He stopped taking medicines. He gave up amphetamine use. Even though he appeared to be rebuilding his life, alcohol continued to control him. The second marriage ended in 1977. It was the last nail in a life already shattered. It wasn't simply another divorce. Carney was late in his 50s. He was unraveling, while other guys his age were considering slowing down and enjoying retirement. At last, Barbara, who had supported him since his early recuperation years in the 1960s, gave up. She thought he had potential and had worked on shows like the Art Carney Special. However, she was no longer able to endure the cycles, relapses, drinking, and promises. In 1965, their love had endured one breakup. It couldn't withstand a further decade of deterioration. Carney became quite lonely after she departed. He would spend whole weekends at his apartment, according to friends. He hardly talked to anyone, surrounded by pill containers and empty bottles. He would occasionally just speak to himself in the mirror. The image was eerie. This was the same man who, like Ed Norton, had once made America laugh. He was all by himself now. Even his first marriage's offspring withdrew. They had no idea how to approach the man he had grown into. It felt more like a joke than a strange proposition when Paul Mazursky asked Art Carney to star in Harry and Tonto. Instead of traveling across the country with a cat, Carney had dedicated his life to making people laugh on television that hardly had a $1 million budget for an independent picture. He had previously appeared in just 2 unmemorable movies. He was being asked to play a fragile 72-year-old guy at the age of 54, but he repeatedly declined, describing the writing as a dull travelogue. He claimed to be too young, but in reality, years of binge drinking had quickly aged him. Due to an old battle injury, he was gray, balding, and limping, making him appear much older than he actually was. Inerski persisted in trying. Some didn't see anything in Carney. Loneliness, pain, and silent strength. Carney was the character. Bill McCaffrey, his longtime agent, gave him a stern shove to get through. "Do it, you're old." That was a powerful blow. It was genuine, yet brutal. Carney was aware of it. However, everything almost came apart just as it appeared that his big chance had arrived. In one scenario, Carney had to carry Tonto, his cat, up a number of stairs. He halted abruptly, stooped, and started throwing up a dark, gritty substance. Everybody froze. Although it appeared to be coffee grounds, it was actually blood, digested blood from internal hemorrhage. A herniated diaphragm had been brought on by years of alcohol addiction, and the physical strain had set off a catastrophic situation. He was sent to a Los Angeles hospital in a hurry. Doctors told him that if he continued to drink, he would die within 6 months. No one outside the set was aware of what transpired. However, Carney appeared to be a ghost when he returned 3 days later, weak, pale, and trembling. To lessen the physical strain, the director had to alter certain sections. Carney continued, however. He had to try something dramatic after that near-death experience. Antibus. It was a cruel substance. He would become really ill if he had any alcohol at all. His heart might pound. He may throw up for hours. However, he required something that powerful. Every bottle in his flat was thrown out. He began to stay away from pubs, restaurants, and even pals who were drinkers. He knew he couldn't give in, so he would sometimes stand outside liquor stores for hours just staring. His shield was Antibus. It prevented him from ruining his greatest professional chance. Then the unimaginable occurred. Art Carney won Best Actor at the 1975 Academy Awards. Not even he anticipated it. Jack Nicholson for Chinatown was one among the other candidates. Legends, everyone. Dustin Hoffman for Lenny, Albert Finney for Murder on the Orient Express, and Al Pacino for The Godfather Part 2. Since Nicholson was the overwhelming favorite, the most of them never even showed up. The audience let forth a shock when Glenda Jackson read Carney's name. Some were incredulous. 4 icons had just been defeated by a man with just 2 small film credits. But the discomfort persisted even after triumph. Carney's scars were still deep. Even though he had made Felix Unger famous on Broadway, he had been passed over for the film adaptation of The Odd Couple years earlier. Instead, the studio went with Jack Lemmon. Carney had always felt that the part had been lost due to his drinking and mental collapse. He was troubled by it. He struggled with regret and worry even after winning the Oscar. Friends saw odd behaviors, such as the way he would precisely arrange coins, placing the larger ones at the bottom. Tiny ones on top, tiny clues that something wasn't quite right with him. The award offered him another chance, but it didn't make things better. Everyone was startled when Carney remarried Jean Myers, his first wife, in 1980. 15 years had passed since their divorce. Paul, Brian, and Eileen were the 3 children of their first marriage, which lasted 25 years. Addiction, however, had ruined it. In his mid-60s, Carney had checked himself into a mental health facility. He was married again after the divorce, but it didn't work out. For the sake of the children, he and Jean continued to communicate. Despite his fame, Art Carney never felt comfortable in the limelight. Despite becoming well known in the 1950s thanks to the Honeymooners, he left the spotlight and never returned. Carney was the only well-known figure absent from the reunion specials that the TV industry began airing in the 1970s and 1980s. It was Jackie Gleason. There was Audrey Meadows. However, Carney consistently refused. He had the opportunity to earn millions, but he chose not to. He would simply respond, "It was a great time, but it was only a time." When asked why, "I don't dwell on the past anymore. It wasn't about pride or money, according to many around him. He simply didn't want to spend even a single night as Ed Norton again." In 1957, Carney's manager had declared him fit to fly alone, but it developed into something more profound over time. According to Carney, sometimes things come to an end, and you don't notice it until you glance back and see that nobody else has turned the page. Dodson. He perceived The Honeymooners, a closed book, in this way. Then something even more difficult to describe appeared. Lung cancer claimed Audrey Meadows' life on February 3, 1996. She was 73. The entertainment industry responded right away. The tributes poured in. Everyone had something to say. All but Art Carney. Not one sentence, not one quote. The fans were taken aback. In his last interviews, even Gleason, who had passed away in 1987, had given his co-stars high marks. Carney, meanwhile, said nothing at all. Some referred to it as chilly, while others labeled it cruel. Carney's acquaintances, however, believed there was more to it. Meadows had expressed her wish that they would speak again in her most recent interview. She didn't believe they harbored resentment toward one another. Sometimes, she observed, silence speaks louder than a fight, and perhaps it did. She never gave a complete explanation for her belief that Carney blamed himself over something. She believed that being reminded of his former self was painful for him. It's possible that the silence wasn't a rejection. Perhaps it was regret. Carney distanced himself from the spotlight even more after winning the Oscar for Harry and Tonto in 1975. He began antibus treatment, gave up alcohol, and led a modest life away from Hollywood. He never sought stardom again, though he did appear in a couple more movies, including Firestarter and The Muppets Take Manhattan in 1984. His final motion picture was Last Action Hero, released in 1993. The last time viewers ever saw him on screen was when he said, "I'm out of here," in the film. Carney avoided attending conventions and retrospectives, while other former celebrities did. He did not participate in interviews. He avoided posing for pictures. He had no desire to be seen as a celebrity. He desired to be by himself. After a brief second marriage and divorce, he remarried Jean, his first wife, in 1979. Together they called Westbrook, Connecticut, home. His days were devoted to reading, gardening, and taking in the peace. According to friends, he wasn't resentful. At last, he felt at ease. And it had taken decades to attain that peace. 5 days after turning 85, on November 9, 2003, Art Carney passed away quietly in his sleep. Natural reasons. No scandals. Not a drama. A peaceful conclusion to a life that had been hectic. He had been clean for almost 3 decades. To ensure that he never slipped back, he continued to use antibus. As private as his life was, so did his funeral. He was laid to rest beside Jean in Old Saybrook's Riverside Cemetery. Somebody would die in 2012. Devin Carney, his grandson, entered politics and is currently a member of the Connecticut General Assembly. The family name endured. Those close to Art Carney claimed that he came to terms with it before the end, even if he never publicly embraced the Honeymooners again. The ache had subsided, even though he might never have spoken it out. The devils had vanished. All that was left was a man who had at last figured out how to live with himself and go out in peace and on his own terms.